advocacy. In Rwanda, it becomes unique, but it's a general trend. So it becomes unique in Rwanda in the sense that any matter that civil society is interested in, which speaks about any political issues, it's very sensitive. We have a very strong controlling state, and they know what they are looking for. They want to be in control. So it's very difficult to come from outside and fund local NGOs and say, okay, here you are, go mobilize against assassination of an official in South Africa. It's very complicated. I don't see how it happens. So what happens, what ends up happening rather, is a situation where you have a concentration of, and then more NGOs will be more interested in service delivery, where they do things from which range from visitation of a peer or who is sick to building a local school or building a bridge which connects two villages. So they're more into that kind of area and not less, I mean, they're addressing real direct issues of society and not really addressing the state or questions which are more sensitive.
Well, I wanted to look at different policy areas because I thought depending upon your issue, your motivation to leave your domestic venue might be different. And that was very much the case in the United States with environmental policy. The industry center groups, your industry associations, they are going to have a lot different motivation than, say, your environmental interest groups. So in terms of emissions policy, they have different objectives, and as a result, they're going to use a different strategy. So when I spoke with groups here in the United States, industry-related groups, very, very few of them were worried about the United Nations. They mainly saw, international institutions more as a menace than something that they could use to help achieve their goals. Where the environmental groups in this country that are pushing climate change policy, they're having a hard time here domestically. So they were much more willing to go outside to build coalitions with other countries, with other groups, use those international institutions as a way to find support. So very, very much issue-based. Same thing with the agriculture, same thing with the reproductive policies. The Canadians, reproductive rights-wise, the pro-choice folks, they are very, very secure in their position. I spoke with a group and she said, anytime that there's any sort of an issue that comes up and one of the MPs will put something up, a restrictive policy, she said, we go after it very hard. We fight it very, very hard because we say one policy is one too many. So we want to make sure it's not a slippery slope that they can build upon. But at the same time, she said, other than that, we're secure. So she said that we are much more willing to use the international institutions, Planned Parenthood International, for instance, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, to try to get them more in line of changing policies and encouraging governments to allow more access to healthcare, more access to birth control, for instance. So they, because of where they are domestically, they are much more willing to use international institutions in a different manner. So it's very, very issue dependent, and that's going to influence not only their objectives, but also their strategy and their tactics.
Thank you all. Very, very interesting presentations. I have a quick question for Chris. I like the Anderson quote too. That's funny. I'm wondering if what you think about the idea that maybe that Anderson quote suggests that they are legitimate rather than illegitimate, though, because I see both of those campaigns as northern problems. So the ban on landmines is a northern problem because people feel morally outraged, but it's their governments that are building the landmines, and it's their tax money that's funding the landmines. So you have these essentially morally engaged and enraged citizens saying, don't spend my tax money on building landmines. I agree, like kind of a poverty tourism problem, similarly like out of photo op tourism, there's a little ethical concern there, but I don't know if it makes their demands illegitimate. Similarly with the, if you talk about the sweatshop campaigns, you've got an American citizen that wants to be able to go buy her t-shirts at H&M and not feel bad about it that it was made in a Bangladeshi sweatshop. So again, it's them being morally outraged and wanting to be able to spend their money in a way that doesn't outrage them. So I guess I wonder if they could be seen as legitimate in that way.
Mainspring.
Yeah.
A gainspring.
Yeah.
I think that's a fascinating question, and I honestly had not thought about that previously, the sense of kind of elites cleaning up their own messes, or sort of like policing your own, and that kind of makes it legitimate, kind of northerners seeking to take care of a northern problem. And I suppose we would probably have to develop a different legitimacy framework. And I didn't know necessarily what that legitimacy framework would be, but I'm certain that maybe kind of a justice framework, for instance. But for me, I'm functioning from sort of an implicit or latently democratic framework. And so once you begin to include a second group of stakeholders, and arguably a group of stakeholders which is much bigger than the originators of the campaign, in order to maintain your legitimacy, you are beholden to act in accordance with their wishes or desires, or to seek to represent their views accurately. And that's where it gets a bit more complex. So, for instance, in like the Oxfam campaign with Sri Lanka, Oxfam had kind of hatched this Northern Fair Labor Rights campaign, and as you say, it is very much geared towards Northern consumers. Northern consumers are part of the problem, and we want factories that are owned by Northern manufacturers to comply with appropriate labor standards. And so in that regard, your standard would make a lot of sense. But then what happens kind of interestingly is they really kind of build almost from the ground up this movement in Sri Lanka where they fund local capacity building, and they gather the unions together, and they kind of build the Sri Lankan voice in order to lobby Northern policymakers, supposedly on behalf of Sri Lankan workers. But then when that Sri Lankan voice escapes Oxfam control, and the Sri Lankan NGOs begin to lobby the British government for continued preferential status for Sri Lankan imports, rather than Oxfam's vision of global fair trade, Oxfam disowns them completely, and, well, not quite completely, but repeatedly drops the ball and never pushes through on that agenda. And so then it really begs the question of, well, you invited all of these developing country NGOs supposedly to the party, but were they there as partners or as props?
And by looking at the three, just quick follow-up, by looking at the three cases, it might give you leverage, where in the one case, like landmines, probably on the ground, people, if there's not a disagreement,
happy
right?
yes.
Nobody wants landmines. But when you get into trade, there may be some countries where it's like, I'd take a sweatshop job over no job. So then you start getting into contestation. There you have an extreme case of contestation where the local went kind of.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the case in, I would say, maybe kind of half of the campaign. So like in the foul ball campaign, you have this sort of thing where you move manufacturing out of these cottage industries because that's where the children are involved, and it's kind of an anti-child labor thing. But then once you take away this form of labor to children, they actually end up working in much more dangerous contexts because they're going to work anyway, and you've kind of actually taken away the safest form of work. And then in the anti-structural adjustment lending campaigns as well, there are like very straightforward comments from activists in Jamaica and the Philippines saying, we actually thought our countries needed some level of structural adjustment because we thought that our governments were overspending and corrupt, and we wanted that fixed. We just didn't want it kind of as extreme as the World Bank and the IMF wanted it. But Christian aid really needed something that could fit on a postcard to their supporters, and so it became just a straight-up no structural adjustment campaign, and the local voices get lost, even though Christian aid continues to trot them out as the people that we're acting on behalf of.
Just a very quick follow-up comment on Christine's comment. What about the framework, like Richard Price's framework on the ban on landmines? That was all that work in the late 90s where he wrote several pieces on that issue from kind of a normative constructivist framework and how it pandered to also northern audiences, which gets a little bit that comment. I mean, I never heard of Anderson before, I thought. But
he's a human rights lawyer.
Okay.
There's a piece is in the European Journal of International Law, I believe.
Okay.
And I have to say that I'm not familiar with Price's work.
So he's written a few pieces in world politics. He's an IR scholar.
I know Price's name, but I think I'm not familiar with it.
Dick Price at University of British Columbia, and that was from kind of a constructivist IR perspective. He was in that same kind of Kaczynski school, but kind of from a different perspective too. Then it seems like how you presented the Anderson case. So that might be interesting framework to look
Appreciate
at.
it.
Yes, any other questions or comments, please?
I have a question.
Yes.
For
Mike, please.
yeah, group, is that group? I have a question in regards to Rwanda in terms of the civil society before the termination of the conflict. So I'm speaking about before you reach that point of post-conflict civil society, what were the main challenges? And the reason why I'm asking is, I understand your point of there is a lot to be done in democratization, but I also see it as a success for Rwanda to be speaking about post-conflict civil society organization, because in societies, I'm from Colombia, and in societies like ours, it's been a huge challenge to reach post-conflict. And a big part of that challenge is the same civil society. The civil society does not have a support from the state in the sense of reaching a consensus, especially in terms of reconciliation and forgiveness and all of these things are a part of the civil society. So my question is, what do you think were the key points that Rwanda implemented, or the civil society in Rwanda implemented, to be able to reach a post-conflict situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Terrific question. And you're so right. So there's a pretty big body of literature on how conflicts, particularly ethnically divided societies, the state-society relations via civil society as a medium gets very complicated. So ethnic conflicts complicates the possibilities for civil society to work in the way we, in ideal terms, we envision civil societies work. So in the case of Rwanda, so the 2 points I already spoke to, alluded to in my talk, and which are really one of the 4 variables I'm investigating, and to see what could have been, and I'm exploring these 4 variables, but I spoke to the political culture in Africa, whereby the idea of civil society really sort of is an inversion of how usually relations between a state and society are viewed, because civil society is viewed as a way of obstructing these paternalistic relationships or neo-patrimonial, whereby the way the state and citizens relate to one another is viewed as an expansion of how we see normally households rule system functions, where a father figure is there to provide and to be dependent upon on so many things, and in return they get loyalty from everybody in the same house. So in Africa there's a way, in a sense, the leader is this, in Africa, is this political leviathan, we can say, you can run to any time. So in Rwanda, that culture has not changed, even with the shock created by the genocide. So the leader is still, that's a culture, that's really where I am, that's my point I'm making. There's no, and these are such powerful imprints in the way citizens view authority, or it's been inscribed in our minds. That's how we view somebody who's superior to you. So what has the government been doing which wasn't being done before, and now it's doing it after the genocide, and the kind of progress we see today? I guess that's really the point I was making. So if you allow civil society to start from the beginning of the spectrum, where you see, okay, let them more civil society, let them start from service delivery, empowering people, building the capacity of individuals, and eventually opening up the political space slightly, and maybe there's a hope that someday they can reach to the point where they can be vocal and vindicate serious questions pertaining to human rights and other issues. But for now, I see it very difficult. Nonetheless, there are some socio-economic gains that Rwanda has achieved more than actually many other countries in Africa who have not been in conflicts. For example, laws were introduced to allow women's participation who have the highest women representation in the parliament, and by the constitution's mandates that at least 30% of governmental positions have to be held by women. So you have different structures to fight against corruption. So it's the second country in the whole continent, the least corrupt in the country. You have structures of representation of the youth and the young people in general. So those are really good things in terms of allowing human rights, although it's not so sensitive in terms of allowing political opposition figures to run a campaign, for example. But nonetheless, there are non-negligible gains that we can discount in terms of the progress we've achieved since the end of the genocide. So there's a hope for me, and that's what I was saying. So if civil society, which comes from Europe, European NGOs helping and providing this technical, financial support to these local NGOs, if they focus on these means and the space between these two extremes, and try to be realistic about the local and political realities that I was talking about. So then focusing in the middle of the spectrum, eventually the space is going to widen and widen, and we can hope, and this is the African